The car of tomorrow and the death of a dream. Imagine a factory the size of a small city, designed to pulse with the heartbeat of the future, now reduced to a silent, hollowed-out tomb. In the dim light of an abandoned warehouse, a single silhouette remains, a sleek, aerodynamic ghost known as the Tucker 48. This isn't just a car, it is a forensic piece of evidence. In 1948, Preston Tucker promised America a miracle of engineering: shatterproof glass, a center headlight that turned with the wheel, and safety features that the industrial giants of Detroit dismissed as impossible fantasies. He didn't just challenge the status quo. He threatened a billion-dollar monopoly. While the public clamored for his car of tomorrow, a shadow was already falling over the assembly line. It wasn't the natural friction of the market. It was a coordinated, high-level siege involving the federal government, the media, and the big three titans who feared his vision. Today, a Tucker 48 is one of the most coveted machines on Earth, a testament to a genius decades ahead of his time. But back then, it was treated as a fraud, and its creator was hunted into bankruptcy. Tonight, we peel back the layers of dust and deception to answer a question that has haunted the automotive world for over 70 years. Did Preston Tucker simply fail to manage his ambition, or was he the victim of a cold-blooded, calculated corporate assassination? This is the story of a dream that was too dangerous to be allowed to live. A visionary rising from the ashes of war. 1946. The smoke of the Second World War had barely cleared, and America was a nation reborn. Returning GIs had pockets full of paychecks and a desperate hunger for the future. Yet, when they looked at the offerings from Detroit's Big Three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, they saw a ghost of the past. The industry giants were stagnant, resting on the laurels of a captive market. They were simply reissuing 1942 designs, adding a sliver of chrome here or a different hubcap there, and calling it progress. Innovation had been mothballed in favor of safe, predictable profits. Enter Preston Tucker. He was not a man of the corporate boardroom, but a man of the garage and the racetrack. A salesman with the soul of a mechanic, Tucker spent the war years obsessing over speed and safety, developing high-velocity combat vehicles and armored turrets. He viewed the automobile not as a commodity to be milked, but as a machine that could, and should, save lives. While Detroit looked at its balance sheets, Tucker looked at the mounting highway death tolls. He saw a void where safety and performance should have been. His first move was a masterstroke of pure, unadulterated ambition. He set his sights on the Dodge Chicago plant. This wasn't just a factory. It was the largest industrial facility on the planet, a sprawling complex that had churned out the engines for B-29 superfortresses. To the establishment, Tucker's bid to acquire this 475-acre titan was laughable. To Tucker, it was the only stage large enough for his vision. When he successfully secured the lease, the ripples of shock were felt all the way to the executive offices in Dearborn and Flint. But a factory of that magnitude requires a specific kind of intellect to command. Tucker began assembling what would become known as his dream team. He didn't want the yes-men or the bureaucrats. He sought out the outcasts, the engineers who had been told their ideas were too expensive or too radical by the Big Three. These were men who lived for the what-if. Together, in the echoing halls of the Chicago plant, they began to draft the blueprints for the Tucker 48. They were bound by a shared belief that the status quo was a cage. The atmosphere was electric with the kind of ambition that precedes a revolution. They weren't just building a car, they were preparing to dismantle an empire. But as the first prototypes began to take shape, the giants of Detroit were finally starting to pay attention. and they didn't like what they saw. The machine that terrified Detroit. To understand the visceral fear Preston Tucker instilled in the giants of Detroit, one must look past the chrome and into the forensic detail of the machine itself. In 1948, the American road was a landscape of pre-war leftovers, heavy, rigid, and technologically stagnant. Then came the Tucker 48, a vehicle that didn't just challenge the status quo, it rendered it prehistoric. The silhouette was the first warning shot. While Ford and GM were still producing upright, boxy carriages that caught the wind like sails, the Tucker featured a low-slung, aerodynamic profile with a drag coefficient that would shame luxury cars built 30 years later. At the center of its face sat the Cyclops Eye, a third headlight synchronized with the steering assembly. It didn't just shine forward, it looked into the future, illuminating curves before the tires ever touched them. It was a piece of active safety that Detroit claimed was unnecessary and too complex, yet they watched its debut with frantic notes and narrowed eyes. Beneath the rear deck lid lay the heart of the disruption, a massive 334 cubic inch flat-six engine. Originally designed for the Bell 47 helicopter, Tucker's engineers converted it to water cooling in a frantic, brilliant 3-week sprint of mechanical desperation. It produced 166 horsepower and a staggering 372 pound-feet of torque, figures that made the contemporary Cadillac V8 look anemic and outdated. By placing the engine in the rear, Tucker eliminated the intrusive transmission hump, creating a flat floor and a cabin of unprecedented volume. But the true wonder, the element that truly terrified the Big Three, was Tucker's obsession with human survival. He looked at the death dashes of the era, unyielding walls of stamped steel, and saw a crime of negligence. The Tucker 48 featured a world-first padded dashboard and a safety chamber, a reinforced cavern in the front passenger footwell where occupants could dive before an impending impact. He installed a pop-out safety glass windshield designed to be ejected by the force of an occupant's head, rather than shattering into lethal daggers. He even proposed the use of disc brakes and a perimeter frame that protected passengers during side impact collisions. This was the forensic reality of the Tucker. It was a car designed by an innovator who asked, "What is possible?" while his competitors only asked, "What is profitable?" So, the wonder felt by the public during the car's cross-country promotional tour was matched only by the growing dread in the boardrooms of Detroit. They realized that if the Tucker 48 reached mass production, the American consumer would never again accept their outdated, dangerous products. Tucker hadn't just built a better car, he had exposed the planned obsolescence and safety negligence of an entire industry. To the engineers at Ford or Chrysler, the Tucker 48 wasn't just a competitor's product. It was a blueprint for their own irrelevance. Every innovation, from the torsioelastic independent suspension to the shatterproof glass, was a nail in the coffin of the established order. Detroit knew that to survive, they could not allow the public to keep wondering, what if? They couldn't just outcompete Preston Tucker. To save their empires, they had to erase him. The invisible hand of the monopoly. By the summer of 1948, the air inside the Dodge Chicago plant had changed. The hum of optimism was being drowned out by the scratching of pens in government offices. Preston Tucker had committed the ultimate sin in American industry. He had moved too fast and dreamed too loud. The Big Three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, were no longer merely annoyed by the upstart from Michigan. They were terrified. They realized that if the Tucker 48, with its disc brakes and fuel injection, reached the masses, their own billions in tooling for antiquated technology would be rendered worthless. The giants didn't need to build a better car to stop Tucker. They only needed to build a better cage. The mechanism of this entrapment was a trifecta of political influence, bureaucratic weaponization, and media manipulation. It began with Senator Homer Ferguson of Michigan. Often referred to as the Senator from Detroit, Ferguson sat on the powerful Senate War Investigating Committee. He was a man whose political lifeblood was pumped by the very manufacturers Tucker aimed to disrupt. Under the guise of fiscal responsibility, Ferguson began applying immense pressure on the War Assets Administration to revoke Tucker's lease on his massive factory. Simultaneously, the Securities and Exchange Commission was unleashed. The SEC's focus was the accessories program. To raise the final millions needed for production, Tucker allowed prospective buyers to purchase accessories, radios, seat covers, and specialized luggage, to secure a spot on the waiting list for the car itself. It was an unconventional move, a pre-order system for the modern age, but the SEC framed it as a criminal conspiracy. They alleged Tucker was selling parts for a phantom car that he never intended to build. This was the forensic scalpel used to bleed the company dry. The investigation wasn't meant to find the truth. It was meant to create a cloud of suspicion that would scare off investors. Then came the media blitz. On June 6, 1948, influential radio host Drew Pearson broadcast a devastating report to millions of Americans. He claimed the SEC was about to launch a massive fraud investigation into Tucker, stating bluntly that the car was a fraud and the factory would soon close. The timing was surgical. It happened just as Tucker was attempting to finalize his financing. Within 24 hours, the company's stock price didn't just drop, it evaporated. The public's confidence, once Tucker's greatest asset, became his primary liability. Dealers who had invested their life savings began to panic. The SEC investigators didn't just look at the books. They physically occupied the plant, seizing records and disrupting the assembly line. Every time a bolt was tightened, a government agent was there to question the cost. This was the invisible hand of the monopoly, not the invisible hand of the free market that rewards innovation, but a suffocating grip designed to protect the status quo. It was a masterclass in corporate assassination. The Big Three didn't have to prove their cars were better. They only had to ensure that the Tucker 48 remained a ghost in the minds of the American people. As the legal fees mounted and the factory lines slowed to a crawl, Preston Tucker realized he wasn't just fighting a business battle. He was a man standing in front of a tidal wave of institutional malice. The dream of a safer, better car was being systematically dismantled, not by engineers, but by lawyers and lobbyists who saw progress as a threat to their bottom line. The Trial of a Ghost. The year was 1949, and the atmosphere in the Chicago federal courtroom was thick with the scent of a funeral. Preston Tucker sat at the defense table, a man whose only crime was an excess of ambition. The SEC had brought forth a 31-count indictment, charging Tucker with mail fraud and conspiracy. The government's narrative was simple and surgical. Tucker never intended to build a car. They characterized the Tucker 48 as a phantom, a collection of blueprints and prototypes designed only to lure in $28 million from hopeful investors and dealers. It was a forensic dissection of a dream. The prosecution focused on the accessories program, where customers bought seat covers and radios to secure a spot on the waiting list. To the government, this was the smoking gun of a Ponzi scheme. To Tucker, it was a desperate attempt to fund production, while the doors of traditional capital were being slammed shut by his competitors' political allies. The trial dragged on for months, a grueling process of character assassination that systematically dismantled Tucker's reputation in the national press. But then came the pivot, a moment of tactical brilliance that would define the trial's legacy. Tucker's legal team realized that no amount of testimony could outweigh the physical reality of the machine. In a move of sheer defiance, 8 Tucker 48s were driven to the courthouse and parked in a line on the street. The jurors could see them through the windows, shimmering, tangible proof that the phantom car was very much alive. These weren't just props. They were functioning, high-performance vehicles that outperformed anything coming out of Detroit at the time. The jury deliberated for only 28 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty on all counts. Tucker had won. He stood in the courtroom, vindicated by his peers, having survived the full weight of a federal prosecution. Yet, as he stepped outside, the victory felt like ashes. While the lawyers argued, the company had been liquidated. The massive Dodge Chicago plant, the largest factory in the world, had been seized and the lease canceled. The machinery was being auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. The dream had been strangled by red tape and legal fees. Preston Tucker was a free man, but he was a man without a factory, without a company, and without a future in the industry he loved. The Big Three hadn't beaten him on the road. They had beaten him in the ledger. It was a corporate assassination, carried out with the cold efficiency of a gavel. The vindication of Preston Tucker. Preston Tucker was silenced, but his ideas were impossible to kill. Today, disc brakes and padded dashboards aren't innovations. They are requirements. The very industry that conspired to bury him eventually built its foundations on his blueprints. While only 51 cars ever left the Chicago plant, those survivors are now among the most coveted mechanical artifacts on Earth. A silent, gleaming testament to what happens when a man's vision outpaces a monopoly's greed. History eventually finds the truth, even if it takes 70 years. If you value the stories of those who dared to disrupt the status quo, subscribe. Help us remember the dreamers Detroit tried to forget.